So this is Inside the Lords for this week, and we're actually on a week's recess for Whitsun, so you won't hear from me for a little while. Might be a great relief. This week has been varied, and the speeches that I focus on below, if you're reading this as Substack, are the ones on the online safety bill, more of which I'll come back to. It will be the last time we discuss the online safety bill until the 22nd of June now, so I kind of get a bit of a break and we're just finishing committee stage. But let me tell you some other things about what isn't said in the Lords and what is said. So first story is that I was discussing the Levelling Up bill, in which completely correctly there was a number of amendments suggesting that pedestrianisation of streets might not always be the best plan for increasing high street, thriving high street communities. They can be bad in terms of people with disabilities, for example. It can mean there's no parking if you want to pop into a shop. And so people spoke very well on that, the dilemmas of it. They can also be obviously very positive and create nice, friendly spaces. I raised the example of forced pedestrianisation around LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, and particularly the impact it was having in a place like Cowley Road in Oxford, and the fact that in reality, despite the fact the council was saying that this was enhancing the community, it was leading to a lot of particularly restaurants and cafes and businesses to close down. And there we were discussing the closures of streets on shops on High Street. I raised an example where this was happening. And the thing that was really noticeable was, despite the fact that everybody else had wanted to talk about the dilemmas of pedestrianisation, as soon as I mentioned this particular dilemma, which was LTNs, silence from my fellow peers. You know, they almost don't want to acknowledge in that context, because it's low traffic neighbourhoods, which is part of the active travel policy of not having anyone drive a car and you have to cycle and walk everywhere, that they all support. That suddenly it was kind of stum. No conversation was had. So that was an interesting observation. Also in that same group, we were talking about licensing for outdoor venues where you will have, Cafe Society brought to the UK. And it has been great fun that one of the only good things that came out of lockdown was indeed the fact that people were able to sit outside, have their latte. And of course, if you're a smoker, that would mean that you weren't huddled in a corner, you were able to smoke outside. And suddenly, everybody who was enthusiastic about these cafes having licensing, although there was some caveats, there was also a range of amendments that said, but you should ban smoking from them. Not just smoking, but vaping. And so when I spoke, again, there was a kind of eerie silence where you just think, oh, I've gone against the grain here. This is kind of an excuse that's been added into a Levelling Up bill to stop people smoking. And one of the problems with so much legislation is it's about banning people from doing things. That's one thing. Secondly, I had a brief speech when I intervened in the illegal migration bill. Now, I want to say we've just had a really productive conversation amongst Academy of Ideas team about what's happening at the Battle of Ideas Festival. And I'm only too aware of the fact that the issue of immigration is front and centre of politics at the moment. And we are wary of the way that immigration is being almost blamed for everything, that it does become a convenient scapegoat, and that even though there are real problems about not controlling the borders, I think there's dilemmas around just easily lashing out in terms of my immigration. So we want to discuss that at the Battle of Ideas. I know it's going to be very controversial, but in the illegal migration bill, the point that I wanted to speak on, and I'm not going to be following this bill all the way through, is that there is a discussion on whether international law and international treaties are being breached by the government's plans in terms of the small boats. And I raised the fact that there is a problem that these international treaties are being instrumentalised almost and used to stop democratic decision making, something that's been voted through the House of Commons, just being told, you can't do that, we've got a treaty, you can't do that, we've got a treaty, you can't do that, because there's a law, an international law. And I argued a very different position. It didn't go down well. But actually, that's not my point, because one of the things that strikes me when I'm going through the online safety bill, which has been my main preoccupation, is that actually the online safety bill breaches a huge range of international norms, for example, in relation to free speech. What about, if I could dare mention, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights that everybody wants to cite everywhere else? There's whole treaties around freedom of expression, privacy, and freedom of conscience and so on that people cite all the time. But when it comes to the online safety bill, there is hardly any of the members of the House of Lords present. Nobody there cites any of these treaties because they actually want to prove that the UK is, as they say, the safest place online. But that can mean a real breach on privacy and free speech. No one there to argue that. In other words, those international obligations are set to one side, irrelevant. The usual suspects weren't even in the room to argue in relation to the online safety bill, which is effectively being nodded through by all the parties as though it's in and of itself a good thing. So I think there's a certain amount of what's not said. In terms of the online safety bill, just a sort of amusing but insightful anecdote, I think, which is that there is a ceaseless attempt at saying that all the bill is trying to do is to protect children, particularly from harms. And my argument has been that indeed, if only the bill concentrated on children, I would be less concerned. But 80% of it, at least, is going to affect adults' access to material and information. So there we are discussing these very things. There was a group of amendments that particularly looked at children and pornography, and I was happy to let the noble lords and baronesses involved in that discussion discuss that without me opposing it, because fair enough. Although I have to say the detail in which people described the pornographic content online was stomach churning on the one hand, but also unnecessarily graphic and repeated at great length by a huge number of people. I was a bit kind of squeamish. Another group of amendments which were actually about future-proofing the bill, which I thought were generally problematic because they were trying to say we've got to make artificial intelligence. We're just doing a little film. Is that okay?
Can we pause?
A group of amendments which were discussing artificial intelligence, the metaverse, all of the possible new ways that people interact online, some of which are very exciting and potentially challenging. You know, we know that there will be things for us to consider, but inevitably in the context of this safetyist, risk-averse atmosphere, the only way that these things were being discussed by the Lords were in terms of how we should curtail them, rein them in, regulate them and so on. And I was arguing that we have to be very careful that such a precautionary principle approach doesn't in the end make the UK completely inhospitable to any kind of technical innovation that you would put companies off, but not just companies, anyone with any imagination, scientific excitement around, for example, the capacity that we've just discovered of artificial intelligence or a use of it and to help somebody walk who has been disabled for many years, and that we can use some of these new tools to break through and do wonderful things. Never mind the fact that we can have a panic about ChatGPT or Google's The Bard. I actually think they're really fantastic new ways of accessing information. They give us potential to do good as well as some of the challenges in terms of harms. But the only way that this was interpreted by the noble lords was to see all of these places as the site for, guess what, sexual activity aimed at children, or proxy sexual activity, because it's things like what happens when an avatar of an adult assaults an avatar of a child, not a real child, but an avatar of, and so on and so forth. So the Noble Lords went into yet more graphic, and I mean graphic detail of the kind of things that could be done in this virtual space. The problem was, halfway through the noble Baroness Harding, Dido Harding of Track and Trace fame, going into what can only be described as some pretty grim details, did the whip notice that the viewing gallery was full of 10-year-olds. So consequently, we had to suspend proceedings while 10-year-olds were escorted from the building. Everybody was a bit sort of flummoxed. And then we were assured that there were no more children due. So after Baroness Harding finished, another Baroness stood up, and she went into what can only be described as very, very, very detailed pornographic descriptions of things that are, as we speak, being done by one avatar to another in the metaverse and so on and so forth, only for us all to look up and find that a second group of 9 and 10-year-olds had emerged, proceedings stopped, and out they were escorted again. It was kind of amusing because, on the one hand, I couldn't understand how this group of amendments, which actually didn't refer necessarily to child sexual abuse, which obviously I am completely opposed to, anything that verges on child pornography or that could expose young people to such horrors. That first of all, we'd inadvertently exposed a load of children to such horrors, I mean, in the discussion at least. But that also, that why was it that was the only way that we could view these new technologies in such a negative fashion? So again, at the Battle of Ideas Festival, we're going to be looking in some detail at AI, the pros and cons, why some of it is a marvellous innovation, but what we need to think about morally and in terms of the challenges. And some of them, of course, will involve how we protect children. So that will be an interesting group of discussions that we're going to have. The whole of the House of Lords is now suspended for a week. There's a lot of South of Francing going on. As far as I'm concerned, it's a great opportunity for me to catch up with the programming for this year's Battle of Ideas Festival, which is the 28th and the 29th of October, and I hope that you will indeed buy your early bird tickets and come along, because that really will be, as I always emphasise, where the real politics will be happening. But one of the things that I've been mulling over, and I think we all have to mull over, is the state of politics at the moment. I mean, I don't need to detail for you the mess it's in. The political parties on all sides, it seems to me, offer very little in the way of an inspiring, future-orientated set of ideals that one can sign up to. I think it's important for us all to consider what kind of new politics we need. There was a slogan that we used to have around, actually, when I was an MEP, which was change politics for good. And of course, that's become very much a betrayed slogan, because politics have not changed for good at all. But I think that we all have a responsibility to not abandon the field. I mean, it's easy to just give up, to become nihilistic, so cynical that you just become pessimistic, conspiratorial, imagine that there's nothing that can be done, it's all futile. And I think that that's a very negative way to behave, but also historically it's not the way to rise to the challenges that we face. So one of the things which the Battle of Ideas will be doing is confronting that notion of building some new movements, how we're going to go about that, what it really would entail. And actually, I'm really pleased that the Free Speech Union has invited me to be a speaker at a discussion on Matt Goodwin's new book on values, virtue and voice. I'm not sure that I've got the title right, but it's a really good read, and that's on June the 7th. And I hope that you'll come along to that. The advert will be below as well. The final thing is that not enough people, lots of people, thousands of people read our Substack, but we really would like more people to participate or know about what we're doing and sign up. So we always want money. That's always good if you're prepared to make a donation. Don't let me put you off. But the Substack is free. It's full of different and interesting content every week. We just had a fabulous Substack on Missy and civility and antisocial behaviour by David Clements, which I thought was a great read. Before that we had Mo Lovett on politics in pubs and building democracy from below. We try and vary the content. So if you take one thing from this, apart from, of course, re-watching my speeches, then please get people to sign up to our Substack. One of the speeches I did in the online safety bill was mentioned in passing Baroness Kishore Faulkner, who runs the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who is subject to a major smear campaign and I'm afraid, very bad faith journalism of particularly Channel 4 in reporting the fact that the staff team at the HRC, because they object to Baroness Faulkner clarifying the law on biological sex and on gender, have really turned on her and have led to a huge range of accusations of harassment and bullying, really unpleasant. And I wanted you to just follow up that story, note that I try and raise these things in the Lords, and note that some people, like Baroness Faulkner in the Lords, despite my abolish the Lords slogan that I always come up with, are actually worth defending regardless of whether they're a baroness or not, because for the sake of politics, we shouldn't allow people to be smeared in that way. So there's plenty to do if you're outside the Lords in defending some of us inside the Lords who are fighting for free speech and are not prepared to be bullied by those who would silence us.